Oh, hello, and welcome to the Super Friends Reviews, where a few friends get together and you guessed it, review. I'm your host, Trevor Aspenson, and I'm joined by my good friend, John Strand.
Hi, I'm happy to be here again.
We're happy to have you, and by we, I mean myself because it's just us. Now, today we are reviewing 2002 seminal work of Spider-Man. But before we do, let's get to, do we have any reviews or emails today, John?
We do. We're kind of in our stages of infancy here with our show, with our channel, with all those things. And so basically the only people who watch this are our friends and family. And so I've got a great review from a person who's pretty close to me. It's my wife. She's upstairs right now. She lives in my house. We spend a lot of time together. And so I'll just kind of read you the review that I got from her.
No bias, obviously.
Well, we'll see. He says, "Hey guys, I just wanted to say that I really enjoy watching your podcast. I've started rewatching all of the Marvel movies in order myself, and I appreciate your reviews of them." So, that's a great review, and she's supposing that we're talking about any of the Marvel movies that anyone actually cares about, but we're not. And so,
Hey.
I said, "Honey, that's not helpful or constructive. That's a wife review, and we need something better." So she says, "Ugh, okay, you got to speed it up. I've got better stuff I've got to do with my life."
No! All right. Well, in that case, we're going to freaking just plow through everything. So we're going to skip the what we've been watching in the comic book movie news this week, and we're going to jump into another little segment that might eventually jump off as a spin-off podcast we do, maybe some mini episodes, and we're going to do some lists. And this week, we are, well, I was inspired by watching Spider-Man's 2002, and spoiler alert, the costume freaking nails it. And so it gave me this idea. So we should do the top 5 hero costumes in movies, not villains, and just heroes and in movies.
I just got really nervous because I didn't really realize that caveat was there, but I didn't choose any villains' costumes, so we're good.
Ooh, nice. All right, all right. Well, should we do a little back and forth countdown from our top 5s?
You are reading my mind, my friend. So we'll start with 5 and work our way towards 1.
Absolutely.
All right. I'll give you my number 5 first. My number 5 is actually one that is fairly recent and fairly timely because my 5th favorite live-action superhero costume is the Black Panther costume. And I'm talking about the Civil War Black Panther costume with the removable helmet for dramatic effect.
Absolutely.
Because I actually like the original costume much better than his vibranium enhanced costume, which we'll talk about ultimately probably when we get to Black Panther in 20 years. But number 5, Black Panther for me.
All right, awesome. Gosh, yeah, I do not have any Black Panther on my list, but I do love that one from Civil War. I am into the vibranium ones, just so because they do have introduced some of the purple that you'd see in some of the actual cartoons and comics. But my number 5 is 1978's Superman, Christopher Reeve's original costume. I don't know how you feel about that. He's, well, I can't say first for everything because he does do the first for everything, but he's maybe one of the only people in all of any superhero comic book mediums that legitimately can pull off spandex form fitting to his body and not have it look ridiculous at all. And it actually looks like a superpowered man wearing spandex, and the colors, everything bounces straight off of the movie. And it looks like it came from a comic book. And yeah, I love it. Original classic.
Yeah, that's actually really true. George Reeves actually, or maybe it's George Reeve, but he was the Superman in the serial in the 1950s, maybe. And he wore the spandex, but the logo was all wrong. It was misshapen and missized and all those things. And so, yeah, Christopher Reeves, probably the greatest spandex wearing superhero that has existed, for sure.
It doesn't look frumpy like it did with George Reeves.
Correct. Very good. Or with What was that movie with Ben Affleck where he played George Reeves playing Superman? Isn't that a thing?
Hollywoodland.
Yeah, right. And so that's another thing entirely.
A
But
good pull.
I thought that was pretty cool. All right, you want to do your number 4, and we'll bounce back like that?
Absolutely. All right. My number 4 is maybe pushing the line of the hero, but Rorschach from Zack Snyder's Watchmen. I had never read Watchmen before going to see Watchmen. Actually, I went and saw it, I'm pretty sure, with you and our friend Mike when it originally came out back in 2009. I thought him in Manhattan, without even having almost any context of the graphic novel, just looked awesome. And now I actually, right above me, have a Watchmen graphic novel that is yours and that I've gone through and read. And it's almost comical how much it is an exact recreation and perfection. And he just jumped out of basically that graphic novel onto the movie. And Zack Snyder does a lot of things wrong, but what he does right is make beautiful images. And Rorschach is a comic book character come to life in that movie.
Dude, the visuals of Snyder's movies are just simply insane, right?
For sure.
And so that Watchmen movie, I think, visually is arresting, and not just their costumes, but also the shots and the pans and all those different types of things. Zack Snyder is probably the king of making the trailers. It's just when there actually has to be like motivations, that's where he runs into some trouble.
In subtlety, yep.
Yeah.
All right, number 4 for you.
Yeah, I pretty strictly stayed within the MCU, within the Marvel movies with mine. I didn't even really think to jump out into DC. And so, honestly, if I did, I probably would have put the Zack Snyder Man of Steel costume, which I know maybe a little bit of a controversy, but I really, really, really love Henry Cavill in that suit. And so that's honorable mention. My number 4 is actually the Ant-Man costume from Ant-Man.
Woo!
I thought it gave a really needed and really cool update to kind of the classic costume. It gave some really good homages to both, the Hank Pym and the Scott Lang costumes from the comics. And so they were able to kind of combine each of those. And actually, Eric O'Grady, who is a third Ant-Man, you even see some of the influence with him in there as well. And I really love that Ant-Man costume and think that it's so cool the way that they kind of vary it and subtly change it. And so I'm excited to see the Wasps kind of design borrowing some of those elements as well.
Yeah, I agree with almost all of everything you just said there. Ant-Man is definitely, I don't want to say guilty pleasure, but I definitely like it probably more than almost anybody else should like it. I love that movie so much. And the costume works well enough that it's the first image on the cover of the movie instead of any of the big stars that are in the movie. So it shows that it gives it a level of respectability right away. And number 3 for you, sir.
All right. Number 3 for me is timely for this video, I guess, because Spider-Man's costume is mine. But of all the different options and of all the different choices we've had in live action Spider-Man, I got to go with Spider-Man Homecoming's costume as my favorite. I don't know if it's because of the proportions of Tom Holland. I don't know if it's because of kind of the fact that it's not this leather motorcycle looking style of costume, but the cloth and the different patterns, the technological patterns on the blue mixed with the webbing on the red and kind of those embellishments of the black lining and all those things. I'm touching myself where all these different suit embellishments are, and I realize you can't see that at all. But I think that the Homecoming costume is such a perfect representation of what a modern superhero costume would look like. And it's not, it never looks like a joke. It never looks ill-fitting. It always looks perfect on him. And I love seeing that representation of Spider-Man, especially with the Ditko kind of emotive eyes that it has and the way they were able to explain how that works. It's just perfection.
Yeah, when you were explaining all that, I didn't even think about the eyes, which might be honestly the coolest part of the whole suit, how they were able to introduce that almost Zack Snyder-esque, introducing the white eyelids for Batman, just bringing something that is so comic book in its essence and being able to make it a cinematic feature. And one of the things they do in Homecoming that I think makes us appreciate how awesome that costume is because Spider-Man 1 through 3, the original series, the costume is I'm a fan of. Amazing Spider-Man 1, the costume's still pretty good, but a little off base. Spider-Man 2, Amazing Spider-Man 2 is, again, they freaking nailed the costume out. And so it's really easy to just kind of take it for granted in Homecoming. But then they have that one scene or a couple scenes where it's loose fitting on him before he hits his button, and it lets you know how ridiculous those tights can really look on somebody. And then he hits the thing, and it immediately form fits him, and he goes from being a awkward teenager to a fucking superhero. To a superhero.
Yeah, like you said, I never thought we'd have a better costume than Amazing Spider-Man 2. That was like perfectly off the page. And this is a chance where we were able to see they changed it a little bit, but in my opinion, they changed it for the better. And I think that it works so well.
All right, now my number 3. All right, I got my first cheating here because I have a tie, and I have the Iron Man Mark III tied with Captain America's first Avengers costume when he's fighting in World War II. I guess the reason I have both of these is the Iron Man one. I had, by the time Iron Man 1, the movie came out, I had been reading comics with you for about a year, and I was fully invested into the Marvel Universe before there was a Marvel Cinematic Universe. And so just seeing some of these stories that I had been reading, just seeing the trailer for the first time of Iron Man flying through the sky and breaking the sound barrier, I will always remember that because of how much it was just real life in my face. And then you get to see the movie where everything is slowed down and it's so much more intimate. And you realize all of these details are holding up. And I've watched Iron Man probably last week, and they all still hold up today. I like the Mark 1 and the Mark 3 in that, or the Mark 2 specifically, because of they didn't need to go through those origins of going through those specific ones from the comic books, which they did take the time to do that, and nobody would really appreciate that. But when it finally comes together and he puts his fire red on it from his car, his hot rod red, at that point, I'm just all in. Tony Stark sells the badass of him and the suit, and it's amazing.
Yeah, right. And, I remember I watched pirated footage of him fighting in the cave that as the Mark 1 suit. And that's, I think, the first stuff that they ever released. And it was at a con, and somebody did a little old school Razor cell phone videotape of it or whatever. And holy cow, I couldn't believe how right they were getting it. And, I wanted to put Iron Man on there, but his suit does so much more than just is a suit. And so I didn't throw him on my list.
And then the other one I had was Captain America First Avenger. To be honest, besides you being my best friend, one of the main reasons you got me into comics was because of the Civil War arc. And you told me about Captain America dying even before I even read the arc, and it got me into basically all of comics after that. And so Captain America has always been my favorite character to read in the comic book pages. He wasn't necessarily my favorite growing up because he wasn't one of the mainstays in just all the mainstream media. But ever since I started deep diving, Steve Rogers became my favorite character. And thinking about putting him in a movie was, one, just blew my freaking mind. And two, trying to think about how to put in that ridiculous outfit he wears, the costume that can look so cool in the comic books, but those fishnets, none of those are going to transfer over. And so what do? They did the thing that they do what Marvel does so well, is they bring in the style of the comic book outfit mixed with the functionality and practicality of what it actually needs to do. And he's wearing a Captain America costume in World War II, and he looks the most badass, which shouldn't be freaking possible.
Yeah, and the way that they introduce that, and they have him wear that garish comic book accurate costume as a joke, as a literal costume for his USO shows and everything. And then he transitions to a functional and combat ready costume as well. That is a beautiful costume. And then when they switch it out for a more modern one in Avengers, it just looks silly kind of by comparison.
It looked like the thing that comic book fans were worried about it was going to look like in the original, for sure. All right, me, number 2.
Yeah,
me too. All right. This one, I almost did a cheat again, but I left off the other one that I was fighting with. But it pretty much could be here too because they're so similar. But Batman '89 and Batman Returns outfit. I put just Batman Returns, but they are so similar. Basically, the only difference is one looks like it's a person's body that is armor, where the other one is just straight up looks like armor. I remember owning Batman 89 and Batman Returns growing up as a kid. Spider-Man and Batman and the original X-Men series is the reasons why I'm into these type of thing. So I've always been all in on Batman. It doesn't have, even though we just went into the functionality aspect of these other costumes, it doesn't have that functionality aspect, but it is so cinematic and it is so beautiful and it sets such a mood without even anything around it, is that it's almost a character within its own. Almost more of a character than what Bruce Wayne is in those movies is that costume and what it represents.
Yeah, for sure, right. And so again, I try to steer more clear to Marvel stuff because that's kind of where my purview is. But I actually almost also threw a Batman on my list, but it would have been the Christian Bale, or not Christian Bale, sorry. It would have been the Ben Affleck Batman from Batman versus Superman, because that's the first time that Batman really looked imposing, not because of armor, but because of his bulkiness. He looked very much like the Dark Knight Returns, and I thought that this is going to be the Batman that I love. And then the movie came out, and that is not the truth.
Definitely, that was my one of my honorable mentions was the gray Ben Affleck suit, because it's just a comic book.
All we had was that first image of him standing by the Batmobile before that movie ever came out. I think I would rather live in that world. My number 2 is a Captain America costume. Is not the costume that you chose, and it's actually a pretty heavy departure from the costume that we see in the comics. Usually, I'm the guy who wants to stay comic accurate, and I want everything to be faithful to the comic book page. But Captain America's stealth suit in Winter Soldier, this is my favorite Captain America costume that I think that I've ever seen. And they actually took that and they adopted it in a lot of the arcs. They put a little bit more white kind of across the chest in those in the actual comic book pages, but the way that thing looks and the way that they mute the shield and the way that his helmet kind of ties it all together, I just think you can't beat that. And it helps that you're introduced to it with that scene on the boat where he's just kicking fools off of it, and you see kind of the super strength be realized so well and so beautifully. That introduction of that costume just made me want to see him in that over and over and over again.
Man, you're right. The two benefits it has is being in Winter Soldier, which is obviously one of the best, if not the best, Marvel movie. And then that opening scene, I remember that more vividly than almost anything else in that movie. If Steve Rogers came alive in the first Avenger, Captain America came alive when he jumps out of that ship at the beginning, or out of that plane in the beginning, and he's literally just drop kicking fools off of a. I'm trying not to cuss because of how badass he is in that scene, and it's so good. All of that's so good. I do like the original stuff with the red and stuff more, but even just for story purposes, him being a part of S.H.I.E.L.D., all of that stuff works so well for that suit, and it does. It looks amazing.
Yeah. Are we on number 1 already?
Number 1 for you, my man.
Oh, man. My number 1 may come as a surprise because it comes from a movie that's not necessarily my favorite, not at the top, not one of the best movies out there, but comes from X-Men Apocalypse. My number 1 costume is when they're training in the danger room at the very end, and Jennifer Lawrence Mystique giving her speech about how you're not little kids anymore. When they pan around and they show Cyclops' uniform in that scene, that is the happiest I've ever been in a comic book movie. The way that they updated it, the way that they moved away from just that muted black leather, they gave him the gold on his visor, they gave him that bandolier strap that goes down and across it, and they modernized the classic 90s Cyclops costume, is just unreal. And then it's obscured. There's no clear view of him wearing it, and it's 3 seconds of the movie basically, and we'll probably never see it again. That's what's frustrating because that's the coolest live action costume I've ever seen.
I definitely almost went to that well of because even like Mystique's costume in there, all of their costumes all of a sudden look like the animated series, which is the reason why I love the X-Men in the first place. Um, but I went to a different place here for this last one.
I'm so excited.
You might have heard of it. Came out in 2002, starring Seabiscuit's own Tobey Maguire. It's this Spider-Man costume. Spider-Man 2002. The raised webbing, the mirrors in his eyes. Even though these aren't comic accurate, I think that they do so much for the character. Maybe it's because I've seen the covers and the posters for these Spider-Man movies a zillion times, and it's a weird mix of 100% comic book accurate, but being able to add 10% of its own thing on top of it, which is it's unique, it's cool, it's beautiful, it looks awesome. Tobey Maguire is the least strong guy I've ever seen, and he has the Christopher Reeves effect going on, where he's pulling off this thing that's form-fitting his entire body, and it never once looks silly.
Yeah, that's very true, and you got to give props to it, right? Because it didn't fall down that rabbit hole of the all black leather, right? It didn't fall down the rabbit hole of trying to move so far away from comic accurate costumes, and it gave him such a great backstory, right? Where it started as that wrestling costume, and obviously we'll get into that as we go through the review. And I'm smiling so much because I've been thinking about that scene for a really long time. But yeah, I mean, to get it that right with the first try, to the point that in 2, I don't even think they altered it at all. Yeah, right. And so you can see how perfectly that transformed a person who doesn't look like Peter Parker to me into a person who looks exactly like Spider-Man.
All right. Well, heck yeah. I thought that was a pretty good list by us both. So now let's jump into the actual review of the movie. Before we do that, do you want to give any initial thoughts on what you thought of the movie before you came back to it for this review, what you thought of it when it originally came out?
Yeah, I don't really have this great memory of going to see this movie. I think I went with a couple of my friends, girlfriends from school. And so, I obviously was trying to impress them. And so I didn't want to kind of show off my nerdy knowledge at that time. But I don't even remember being super excited. I don't remember being, kind of breaking down the walls to see it. But I do remember on the way home, I was just kind of in awe of how well it worked for me and how well that movie kind of defied my expectations and exceeded my expectations as well. And so it's really weird. It became kind of this this go-to movie. I remember when it came out on DVD, I watched it over and over and over and over again. And so I think that's really a point that got me not introduced, but interested in going back and seeing those cartoons that I watched as a kid, right? And kind of really, really, really diving deeply into comics at that time.
All right. And honestly, mine was kind of the opposite way of I was so freaking jacked for this movie. This is a point in my life. I was 12 years old when this movie came out. I was probably either going to be late for school or about to be late for school every day, but I would still get up early enough to watch the animated series that they had on Fox super early in the morning of the reruns of the animated series of Spider-Man I used to watch. So I was still all in at Spider-Man. Instead of being cool, I had Spider-Man blankets and sheets still at this point.
That is cool, dude. It's come full circle.
And so I even remember waiting specifically in line at the movie theater for hours to get into this movie with family members because I was 12 and I couldn't get the movie there by myself. And I remember, honestly, the first half of this movie I could have probably almost had memorized by the time 2002 was over. There's so many specific instances that we'll get into as we go through the actual plot of just vivid memories of this movie. This was right there with Batman 89 for me, as it just completely changed almost what my interests were in general. And I was just, I was all in on these from then on out. All right, so from there, let's just jump into the actual movie, which starts with some opening credits and we're in Tim Burton's Batman world because Danny Elfman decided to stop by. Which I think I definitely did not know any of this as a kid, that the person that scored Spider-Man also scored one of the only VHSs that I watched a zillion times as a kid. But it does really, and I think it's almost a theme that I'm going to come back to a couple times, is that this Spider-Man movie, I think, needed to be such a big hit for the studios, is that they were taking anything they could from the two previous successes of this genre that were these massive successes, and that's Superman 78 and that's Batman 89. And no better example than an opening up with the Danny Elfman score, exactly like how they do in Batman 89.
Yeah, right. And one of the things that I think is so interesting is that it doesn't sound like Danny Elfman, right? It doesn't sound like Batman 89. And so you can see kind of the true genius of his work, right? Because each of those, even though they follow kind of a similar progression, they divert from each other in ways that make them so unique and so different. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is that even though Batman's a much darker character, there was so much kind of tension that was built in the Spider-Man score that wasn't there in Batman. Batman seemed much more epic and much more kind of it was building towards this climax that you could see that was kind of crashing down. But ultimately in Spider-Man, I thought that there was a lot more mystery and a lot more kind of tension as it was coming together. And I always thought that that was interesting because it never stood out as weird to me, and it never stood out as mismatched. It seemed like he nailed those characters by using those different concepts to differentiate them just enough.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, there's never a point in this where I think he's just, not to hate on John Williams at all, because John Williams is one of the best to ever do it, but there's sometimes you can hear John Williams score. I used to get Star Wars and Superman's theme as a kid kind of mixed up because they're pretty similar, which makes sense. They're super epic and they're super iconic. But there's never a point where you'd mix up the Spider-Man theme with the Batman Tim Burton no 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 theme.
That was good. I loved it.
But it sets its tempo. It's a different tempo than the gothic expanding Batman universe that they set. But I like it. I like all of this beginning stuff into the Tobey Maguire voiceover talking about Mary Jane. We get the first shot of Mary Jane. We get Peter chasing the bus. You got any thoughts on any of this opening stuff? The field trip, going to the field trip, any of that?
Yeah, right. And so we got a lot of stuff that we're dealing with here. You can see, obviously, Peter Parker as a nerd, and they play that up super well, where nobody will sit with him. Even people that we generally see as obviously not popular, right? Even the big slovenly kid won't share a seat with him as well, right?
Yeah, one thing that I have to say about that, it was the very first thing I wrote down. What kind of fat person eats a jelly donut with the jelly falling out of it? He's perfected that. I know, but at this stage in his life, he's perfected the jelly donut, and that might have been the most unrealistic sequence in the movie.
But how are you supposed to understand that he's sloppy and that doesn't have any friends if he doesn't spill on himself, right? He's a filthy human being, and he doesn't want to be Peter Parker's friend. Because even though Peter looks normal, besides the fact that obviously he's an urchin because he wears eyeglasses, right? That's what I believe. You see that even this guy won't sit next to him, and so there must be something wrong with Peter. But overall, I think that this introduced a part of the genre that we see over and over and over and over again, which is the hero narrating at the beginning. And they give us this looming advice about life, or this great rhetorical question that we're meant to answer coming towards the end, right? It gives us a theme throughout the movie, but it was super novel at that time. And so a lot of people, like CinemaSins, they'll make fun of narration to start a movie. But this is kind of where we got that from in the first place. And so I think that it's really interesting, and it gives us so much of this introspective journey that Peter Parker makes, even though this is a movie about Spider-Man. But yeah, kind of using this, I don't know necessarily if it's exposition, right? But using this kinetic event of him chasing the bus to tell us a story about who he is as a person compared to his peers. I think it actually works pretty well.
Yeah, I definitely think so too. This is what I wrote down for this. Exposition, I think, is probably the way, even though it feels like exposition such like a dirty word, like it's not good storytelling, even though the way they do this is so good. In the first 7 minutes of the movie, we find out Peter lives with aunt and uncle. He doesn't have his parents. Peter's really smart, not just for a high schooler, but he's smart in general. Peter and Harry are best friends because Harry calls him Pete. Peter is the biggest nerd. Peter's into photography. Peter loves MJ. Peter and Norman now have a relationship. All of that stuff is done, told to the audience within 7 minutes of the movie starting. And none of it feels like Fantastic Four 2005 trying a little too hard to give us the information. All of it feels so organic. Even up to the Forrest Gump treatment Peter's getting on the freaking bus of seats taken.
You can't sit with us. Also.
And that bus driver is a dick.
Yeah, just doesn't let any of that happen. And he's been chasing us since Woodhaven Boulevard, right? And so you got a good old Mary Jane stepping up and seeing kind of her character as well. And obviously, we'll talk about Mary Jane. I don't know if this is the best time for it right here. But that whole section, like you said, you take it for granted as a comic book fan, right? We've seen Uncle Ben. We've seen the origins of Peter Parker for so many years. So it's tired and it's played out. But the fact that they're able to do that and do that so quickly in such a natural way, I think is interesting, right? And obviously it makes sense that all these people are crossing paths. And that's one of the greatest parts about telling it as a high school story, because obviously all of these characters have a reason to interact with each other every day.
Yeah, one thing I also thought was so cool, taking a lot of time on just this first scene, but I love just like the first half of this movie is just so done so well. And I just love the fact that like you would think that they're getting on the bus to go to school, but they're getting on the bus to go to the spot where Peter's going to get his powers. And that could easily have taken an extra 45 minutes to an hour to get to that field trip. Or we could have gone to school and we could meet all of the kids that way. And we could really beat it over the head how big of a nerd Peter really is. And how much Harry isn't a smart guy. And how much MJ likes bad guys. And all of this stuff that we do get so economically, that could have been with worse storytelling just dragged out. But we're already getting to the spot where people want to be, is Peter freaking getting bit by a spider. But right before then, we get to meet Norman and Harry on the way, played by Willem Dafoe and a little up-and-comer named James Franco. You got any thoughts?
Oh, man. Willem Dafoe, I think, is a perfect villain, right? His face is carved from evil itself, I feel. And especially the way that ultimately later we'll talk about the goblin's design, but the way that the evil and the menacing goblin mask mimics his actual face, I think is incredible, right? And we get to see how much of a jerk his father is. We get to see that he's focused on success, by any means necessary, and the fact that his son can't live up to his expectations isn't something that he, extends a hand to help him or to assist him. But he says basically, this Darwinism, social Darwinism of, the survival of the fittest is that ultimately you don't have the right to call yourself my son. And so do something about it. Otherwise, we'll have to distance ourselves from each other, right? We can see how much of an awful, maniacal person he is even before kind of the villain treatment as well. And Harry, as much as I love James Franco, is fairly nondescript. I think that I have such an affinity for the character in this movie because it is James Franco and for nothing else. But I will say, before this movie, my view of Harry was nothing at all like James Franco at all. But now when I think of Harry Osborn, that's all I think of. And so he's definitely transformed the role for ill or for good. This kind of remains to be seen.
Yeah, for sure. When I thought of Harry before these movies, and I guess still sometimes, it always goes back to the animated series for me, where the Osborns, basically the way you could tell they were Osborns was they had red stripes in their hair or whatever for some reason.
Mhm.
But watching this scene over again and trying to watch it, because I've seen this movie a zillion times, but every time I watch it as a fanboy every single time because it's absolutely one of my all-time favorite movies, changed my life, all this stuff. I love this movie, but I'm trying to watch a little more critically for this, so I'm not just waxing poetically about it the whole time. And nondescript, I think, is the best way to describe Harry, because I was trying to put my finger on it. Of I can tell that Norman isn't being a good dude in this scene, but he doesn't seem like he's being over the top awful. And it kind of seems like Harry's maybe being a shithead, but it also seems like he's maybe being sympathetic. And it's like it's hard to get a grasp on what I'm supposed to be feeling from these two characters, especially because Norman gets out of the limo right after, brings Harry his bag, and then he has this actual pretty nice meeting with Peter, and he's giving Peter all these props, and he feels like he has some warmth in him. And maybe this is Harry's fault, but this would be one of the main things in the movie that did disappoint me, is that all of the Spider-Man stuff I love, and that makes sense because that is the through line. I think the Osborn stuff, the Norman and Harry's relationship is just, I wish we'd had maybe just another scene or just a little more of their actual perspective of what's going on between them. Because besides him actually turning into the Goblin later on, and we get like Thanksgiving scene and things like that, we don't really get that other scene. I guess a 10-second, 5-second thing at graduation where he says that he proved him wrong, him just being a dick, and Harry just being walks away and looks at MJ, and it's almost the exact same scene we get in that car. And
Yeah.
I don't know if it's being purposely ambiguous, leaving maybe Harry open as he could be good, he could be bad, depending on where he goes in the story. It just felt, like you said, in much shorter words than nondescript. It was very just nondescript from Harry Osborn, which is so weird.
The complexity of their relationship is something that a lot of this movie hinges on, but we're really not shown that, right? And this is no 127 hours performance from him. I think James Franco is capable of being an incredible actor. I don't know if he's gotten into into the swing of things by this point at all.
Yeah, this is I either read or heard this somewhere, and it really hit it on the head of this is the least James Franco's ever been. He is so subdued in this, and that can be good. Like, he's not the hero, he's not the villain of the story. He's the hero's best friend, and the bad guy's the antagonist's best or son. So maybe he isn't meant to be that strong of a character, but yeah, it's so weird to watch somebody who has such screen presence and charisma, and he doesn't demand any scene at all in this entire movie, which is just, yeah, it's just strange with the meta knowledge we have.
Yeah, for sure, right? And then one of my big things is obviously, we're spending a lot of time before Peter even gets his powers. And I feel like so much of this movie is before he becomes Spider-Man. And I don't know what the runtime on this is, but I feel like so much of it is before he's Spider-Man. And then there's so much that happens after he is Spider-Man. And so, we go in and we see all of the field trip taking place, and the exposition there being told by a tour guide, I think, is actually kind of genius. Even though what she's saying is absolute nonsense, right? The fact that here's this spider that has a web that has the 20 times the tensile strength of steel. Here's a spider that can jump 1,000 feet at once, right? And so we're seeing all these, I don't know what we call them, super spiders, as she says. And there's so many things about this that is just the sheer idiocy of comic books that you have to just suspend your disbelief and enjoy, because it's, everything from all of his powers to the reason for the coloring. All these things are explained, well or not is up to you. But I think it's so interesting the way that they put this all together, and they took a completely asinine plot from the 1960s of this spider descending from the ceiling and being caught by this radioactive wave that they're testing, and all of this chance. And they took it and they said, we're doing scientific experiments on them. There's this testing, this technological breakthrough that we're attempting to make. I think they did an awesome job of modernizing that. But my least favorite thing about this whole scene is how the teacher always shows up and says, "You were talking during that woman's entire presentation." Let's go talk about how we listen. And he says the next person who talks will fail this course. I kid you not. And then they talk throughout the whole thing. And I bet they didn't fail because Harry graduates. And so what kind of teachers do they have at Midtown? You know what I mean? Like people who don't follow through on their threats.
Oh man, that is funny. I didn't even think about that. The scientist telling us the Peter Parker's powers is one thing that I've probably always realized without ever actually being conscious of realizing. And it goes back to us taking for granted of just knowing who Spider-Man is and everything that's going to happen is we know how the scenes eventually might not how it's going to play out, but we know how eventually where it's going to. And that's Peter getting bit. One of the things that I do love in this, that actually it's a theme they do a couple times in this movie because the movie is almost about like becoming a man, taking responsibility, that type of thing. And in just this opening scene, it's showing Peter be a really passive character towards MJ. And during that, he has his best friend then go up and hit on her right in front of him because he's such a passive character that he doesn't do anything about this. And his friend, maybe they would never known each other or start dating later on in the movie, Harry and MJ, if Peter's not willing to just stand back and let life happen. But then less than a minute later, he finally takes some action. He asks MJ if she wants to be in this picture. He becomes an active character. And less than a minute later, he gets bit by the spider and becomes a superhero from it. And so it's showing him taking responsibility for his life before he gets the, obviously, quote that we're going to get to from Uncle Ben. And it's showing him trying to become a man, almost going back and forth between this insecure kid and this person we're going to see hopefully by the middle of the movie, end of the movie, which I just thought was cool. They kind of parallel those throughout the entire movie of him being passive and him being active and the things that come out of that for the character. And when he's an active character, there good things happen. And when he's a passive character, bad things happen. And so it all comes back to Uncle Ben's quote about obviously responsibility. And so after that, we get a bite. We get Peter back at his home.
No thanks, had a bite.
And then we get some of the Oscorp background. We get to see Norman giving the generals, or walking in on Strom. Is that the Dr. Strom giving the report of what their super soldier serum is, basically their Captain America serum they're trying to make. And it's filled with, you get muscle, agility, all of the super soldier stuff, but you also get insanity because the rats they've been doing get it and go insane. And so this is where Norman gets the idea that he is going to use the formula on himself. Otherwise they might lose funding. And this scene comes back to what you were talking about with just the aesthetic of what Willem Dafoe's face is when he wakes up in the morning. The scariest he is in this entire movie, which also looks the most least scary, I guess, is when he is first getting strapped down and Sam Raimi leaves in the clip of Strom putting the metal on him and he gives a, "Ooh, that's cold." That part gets me every time. I don't know if Defoe's just that good of an actor or if that's genuine because it is such a good line reading. And then less than 2 minutes later, we get the smoke, the green smoke filling up, which I thought was an awesome comic book touch. And then he jumps out back to formula, and he jumps on almost like he's on the glider, and he makes this goblin face. And at that moment, it's like, let that be the costume. Just a shirtless Defoe running around, and I am okay with all of this. But I love the transformation.
Color it with like some green lighting so it's real subtle as well. But spoiler alert, that's not what they did.
With the gas?
No, leaving the not having a costume.
No, for sure.
Yeah, this scene I think is crazy, right? And so you see him walking through and trying to give them this rose-colored glass of how the tests have been going. He says that they've been mostly positive, but there is this side effect of insanity, right? And so Dr. Strom says we got to take the whole thing back to formula, and that's where you see Norman snap, right? And that's where you see that he's so obsessed by progress, and he's so obsessed by ultimately success that he's willing to overlook what he sees as kind of a negligible issue, right? Yes, it's causing insanity, but that's a small price to pay for this power and this prestige that he's really seeking. And so we see this whole idea of the Holy Grail, right? It's this archetypal story that we see over and over again. What are you willing to sacrifice for, achieving your goals? And for a lot of heroes, it's I'm willing to sacrifice my own happiness and my own, my own strength. I'm willing to give up things for myself to achieve this. But for him, it's I'm willing to sacrifice the safety of everyone else for me to achieve this great thing. And that's why I think he works so well as a villain, because there's no altruism, but he thinks what he's doing is right. And so you see that he's maniacal in that case, and he has no moral compass, which makes him such a great contrast to Spider-Man.
And I love your reading of that scene, and I think that is all the intent of everything they're trying to do. This is where I wish we would just get a little bit more Norman away from the Peter Parker stuff, because we go straight from the Harry scene with Norman to this, and there's no really in between explaining why he needs to get this done. To be honest with you, my reading when I used to watch this movie was that the company was always just about to be taken from him, and that they were like almost on the brink of bankruptcy. And if this doesn't go through, then he's absolutely finished. And that has to do with some of the stuff later on in the movie where they basically tell him, Norman, you're out. Yeah. And so as a kid, I always just thought that that's what was going on at the beginning of this movie. But that's not what's happening. It's just military contracts. And obviously military contracts are worth billions and billions of dollars. And so to lose those would be bad for the company. But that's not necessarily going to ruin him, his company, or his company's future. It'll just take a dip on their stock and their bottom line for the year or the next few years, whatever it is. And so it is just him being reckless of wanting to prove the progress, like you said, he was making. And I just don't feel like we ever get enough of that. Willem Dafoe is such a good actor, and so he has enough inference in some of these scenes where you feel his anger and you feel what he wants you to feel, but I never really understand. Like I said, I thought they were going to lose the company, and that's just a miscommunication by them to somebody who's taking notes during the movie. And then all of a sudden later on, I realize that that's not what's happening. And yeah, it's just his ego and the best of him, and probably the thing that got him to where he is at in his business, and the rich man that he is and the successful man as he is willing to push these limits on science and boundaries that people probably tried to set for him ever since he was a young guy. And so some military guy who doesn't know what he's talking about and can be the one to stop him. But honestly, all of this basically just hinges on what Dafoe is doing. And where I was praising all of the little dialogue and all of the little things that were happening in these Peter Parker scenes, I think it's almost the exact opposite in all of these Norman Osborn scenes. Is Dafoe is bringing it, but there's almost not the material around him to lift up anything that he is trying to do right now.
Yeah, right. They're trying to do too much with too little, I think. And
yeah.
I think the fact that he is so entitled to his success, and I think that the fact that he is so filled with hubris, I think it actually works a little bit for me, right? Because, like you said, his company may not be on the brink of collapse, but him losing that funding is not just a loss to his bottom line and a loss to his money, but it's this incredible hit to his pride, which is something that he can't abide. And so I think it does less for the writing of the movie, but it does more for the character as a whole, I guess. But yeah, I totally get what you're saying, is that they don't devote enough time to his development because they do have to develop so much with the old Peter Parker.
For sure. And speaking of Peter, now we were talking about before we reviewed just the parts that we really remembered going into before watching this movie. This whole next, 45 minutes probably is something I probably had memorized ever since I was 12, 13 years old. And it's Peter wakes up with powers. He falls asleep and he's this scrawny kid. He wakes up. If he puts his glasses on, he can't see. If he takes them off, he can see perfectly. All of a sudden he's ripped. When he runs down the stairs, he doesn't even use stairs anymore. He's just running on the freaking wall, and apparently he doesn't get in trouble for that. And then little things like chasing after the bus. This time when he catches the bus, he rips the sign down. All of this stuff I remember watching in theaters as a kid and just being in guffaw of all of it, because it was just everything that I wanted to be in Spider-Man was this manifestation of the powers he was getting.
Yeah, right. And you see that they reveal his powers so naturally and in such mundane ways that, like, oh, yeah, his hand stuck to a poster. Oh, he's shooting webs and he's getting it stuck to a lunch tray, right? And none of the powers are inherently cool at that point, but because you know what they can develop into, like each new discovery is a moment that you nudge your friend next to you and you point at the screen and you're just like in awe of what they're doing. Because again, they naturally show you his powers. You understand how they work in a high school setting. And so somebody who's never heard of Spider-Man before, as impossible as that is, they understand how he works so well, so quickly because of the way that works, all the way down to his spider sense with the fight that he has with Flash, right? And there you can see that he understands his surroundings. You can see his super strength. You can see his agility. You can see his quickness, and it's all done under the auspices of a high school hallway fight that everybody can connect to. And I think that that's so cool the way that they do that in a real world situation.
For sure. And no exposition is done here at all. And you're just running with the character. You're learning as the character's learning. The reason why superheroes are cool to kids is you want to be that superhero. You want to be in their shoes, and that's exactly what they're doing in these scenes. Is they're letting you be Peter and be as amazed as Peter is. And obviously, this movie came out 3 years after The Matrix did. It was probably being filmed about a year and a half after The Matrix came out, which was like the biggest thing ever in action films. And you can see that influence all over in these scenes, and very specifically the spider sense. Against Flash scene. But honestly, as a kid, this might have been my favorite scene in the entire movie, is when he learned that his spider senses could basically slow down time. Oh, even now, it makes me feel like a little kid thinking about it. It's just the 2 or 3 backflips he does is a little over the top for me. Yeah. But besides that, just the actual beating him up part was just... I'm on Harry's side where he's like, that's amazing. And everybody else is like, you're a freak, Parker.
You're a freak. You really are a freak, Parker. Yeah.
And I wrote down, there's definitely a girl in the background that yells, Flash, get up. And then you get it about 2 seconds later, I'm out of here.
My favorite part of the fight is when he's
realizing so funny. His quickness. Man.
The arm comes in. And Flash like swings at him, and Peter goes and like just looks around a bunch of times, and you're like, "Oh, look how fast he's going!" And I always wish that they had a cut where they'd show that like in normal speed, how stupid that would look. But I don't know. That's one of my biggest pet peeves is when they have like slow motion effects in movies, because they always would look so silly if they were sped up. But again, like you said, there's the backflip there. There's all this kind of crazy stuff, but none of it matters because of the payoff of that moment is so cool to see how all of those things work together. But again, instead of being like, holy cow, that dude just did a backflip over Flash's punch. That's awesome. Everybody's like, you are a real big weirdo.
Oh, all right. And then the next thing I got here is leading us into our wrestling as we get the MJ outside talking to Peter scene, which I thought was a real cool scene. As much as I was just kind of bashing on some of the Norman scenes where I just don't feel like there's a ton of depth, I guess maybe would be the right word, in the scenes. There's just not a ton to grab onto. I feel like almost every time these two share the screens, and this might be an unpopular opinion because I know some people aren't super into the Kirsten Dunst Mary Jane. Some people aren't into the Tobey Maguire Peter. Anytime these two are sharing scenes together, I'm pretty much all in on these. It might be because I was in love with Kirsten Dunst as Mary Jane when I was a 12-year-old kid. Again, I wanted to be Spider-Man. Spider-Man loved her, so I loved her. The whole story is about this girl. But just these little sweet scenes with Peter telling MJ, he remembers her play from when she was in third grade and her being so embarrassed and on the fence to tell this guy who's the geekiest guy in school that we already know how big of a geek he is. The bus driver won't even stop for him, but she's still so embarrassed to tell him her dream of wanting to become an actress because everybody around her in her whole life has basically not gave her these dreams and tried to make her feel as small and as little as she possibly could. Where Peter's the exact opposite, where Peter, even though he's never came from a point of strength until now, this inner strength he's starting to find is still showing strength in her, in the feelings he has for her. And there's a small moment where we get a legitimate emotional Kirsten Dunst, and then she gets picked up by Flash Thompson. In one instant, Kirsten Dunst goes from I'm sad and I'm not the person I want to be to woo, Valley Girl running out to the car, and I can't remember exactly what she says, but something about how cool the car is or something like that. And it's like, okay, I don't care what people says about Kirsten Dunst. Like, this is acting right. This is what this character is to me in this movie. This is a hurt, broken girl that has this facade of being this pretty strong girl, and really it is just that, where Peter is openly weak. She's underneath it all week, and they're using each other almost to find strength and build each other up.
Yeah, for sure, right? And you see in that moment that there's this tension, right? And I like something that you said before is that when Peter is passive, bad things happen to him. When he's active, good things happen. And you can see in that scene, she's almost begging for him to become active, right? And you can see that she's almost pining for him, but he never thinks a girl like that would give him the time of day, right? And so he discounts himself. And it's almost like she's asking for him to make a move or asking for him to tell her that he loves her and to tell her that he wishes that they could be together, because it's almost like that's what she's looking for. That's what she really wants. But then, like you said, when Flash shows up, she puts on this mask and she becomes this person that she's really not, because that's what society kind of expects of her. And, going back and seeing this, I think that she's fairly wooden in a lot of the scenes. But like you said, when I was a kid, I was obsessed by her, right? And she was Mary Jane to me, and she made that character what it was in the film. And so I have this weird nostalgia for her, while also wishing they would have gone a different direction with her. But I think that their chemistry is all about tension, and there is this awkwardness there because that's what their relationship is kind of defined by. So I think it definitely works. And obviously, they made the best out of what they had. I don't particularly like Tobey Maguire as Peter. I don't particularly like Kirsten Dunst as Mary Jane. But when they work together, they kind of make up for each other's faults. And so I think it works well as a relationship dynamic.
That is well said. That is honestly probably the reason why I do like both of them, is I think they just kind of both give each other pathos, maybe is the right word. They just feel like, yeah, that they add a dimension to each other without even words. Like you said, their chemistry isn't necessarily Garfield and Emma Stone going to be making out every second chemistry, flirty, cutie, this is ideal relationship. It's the two people that are almost broken that are coming together and fixing each other. And adolescence, they're broken, and now as they're trying to move on past that, which they literally move from Queens to New York, and they try to move past all of their old bullcrap, they're there for each other basically throughout all of that. And yeah, I just really am into the MJ Peter stuff in this movie. And then we get some wrestling. One of the things I thought was so funny that I didn't really realize until I was watching and taking notes this time was that Peter's doing all of these drawings for the costumes or whatever. And he finally gets to this awesome looking Spider-Man costume. And then the next time we see him, he's in his homemade costume. And it is such subtle humor, and it is so funny, because it is the age-old question, is how does a 17, 18-year-old kid get this next level costume that he always has in the comics? Which I thought was awesome. And then in this wrestling scene, we get a host of some cameos. We get Oscar-winning Octavia Spencer is getting out tickets to this.
Oh my gosh. Holy cow.
Yeah, that was I don't think I ever really realized she was in this movie. The small fry line she gives, she actually does give a couple of decent line deliveries in this for having about 10 seconds of screen time. And then we get, of course, Bruce Campbell, Sam Raimi's main man, the human Spider-Man. And then we get the Macho Man, Randy Savage.
Bone saws ready.
Do you have any specific feelings, opinions on what's all happening here or what?
Yeah, I have two things to talk about in this scene. I'm going to go back to your drawing situation first. When I rewatch this, I laughed so hard at every little sketch that he does is like a comic book cover, right? And so underneath this nerdy, geeky valedictorian photographer, he's also like an elite level comic book artist as well. But instead of pursuing any of that stuff, he just, goes down in the dumps and can't find work anywhere, right? And we see that he's designing this this costume, and we see him ultimately, land on the blue and reds that we're used to. But then, like I said, he has this screen printed, this balaclava, this shirt that has no details on the back at all, with these ill-fitting blue sweatpants. And I just hate so much what that wrestling costume looks like in this, and I can't go back and look at it, and it makes me so mad.
I love the wrestling costume, by the way.
No. Oh, I don't even know how to respond to you after that. But my other thing with the wrestling is it shows so much about the time when this movie was made, right? Because we're supposed to hear about, here's the wisecracking Spider-Man, right? Here's the Peter Parker who is able to use humor to diffuse the situation. And the blatant homophobia that is laid out by Peter, the hero of this movie, when he says, what, that's a cute outfit. Does your husband make it for you? Implying that, oh my God, calling this dude gay is maybe the most offensive thing I could probably do right now. And so just the fact that joke was made totally dates this movie and totally tells us how tone deaf the culture was. And it's so weird that that's going to live on forever as a joke that is so, deaf to reality of kind of what happens. But other than that, the scene shows off a little bit more of his powers. We see this seminal moment of Spider-Man's history of the wrestling kind of career that he develops, and using his powers for ill and using his powers for personal gain. I don't think you could really ask for a better scene, right? And we've got the old bonesaw Macho Man Randy Savage that really hams it up and gives you an idea of the types of characters that wrestlers are, and the human spider fits into that so well.
Yeah, a couple things from this scene. One, he finally strikes a couple of his Spider-Man poses in this scene. His absolutely iconic Spider-Man poses are so cool. This is probably why I'm just into the outfit. I just spoiler alert, I love the Macho Man Randy Savage. Slim Jims are maybe my favorite food ever made. I'm just all in on everything that is happening in this scene. But one of the things I wanted to bring up earlier that I can bring up now is this whole movie from beginning to end is so comic book aesthetic. Is that there's just something that feels almost there with Metropolis and Gotham. Even though this takes place in New York City, it feels like a fictional place this takes in. This all feels like it's not even from in the past or future of our world. It feels like it's almost a different parallel universe to our world, with the colors, the way people act, just all of these things. Everything's just a little heightened. And this scene, I just think, is one of the most perfect representations of it. This is so ridiculous, so over the freaking top. It's literally like a 60-year-old man who's so roided out and on so much cocaine that he should not be fighting a 16-year-old kid with a freaking crowbar. And I just love every second of it, because the tone that this is all set, I believe it. And there might not be drama in this scene, but there's something cool about watching Spider-Man beat up a guy that is so much bigger and so much stronger than the person that he's going against. And then, like I said, you get to see some of his acrobatics. Anytime you see Bruce Campbell is so freaking awesome. I love all of this, and this is basically straight up from the origin, right?
What are you doing up there?
I got you for 3 minutes.
This
3 minutes of playtime.
Yeah. Staying away from you. Oh, but yes, that is so much like it. The real wrestler's name, I think, was Crusher Hogan, and I think that is a little bit of a kind of subtle joke, right? The fact that they got Macho Man, who is such an antagonist to Hulk Hogan, who that character was obviously based on. I think that that's a really nice little touch as well. But I think that this is a really cool depiction of that scene, right? And we've never really got the wrestling scene again, right? We see homages to it in Amazing Spider-Man where he falls down into that wrestling ring. But we've never seen something that is so comic accurate with the whole origin of where the theatricality of Spider-Man comes from, where the over-the-top character comes from. And again, everything moves so rapidly, but I don't feel like pacing is really an issue, right? And so we've moved along here. We've seen Peter grow with this angst. We've seen that he's tired of being pushed into the background. And now that he finally has powers, he wants to do something with them to finally not be the guy in the background, to not be the nerd. And this is the way that he kind of strikes out and does that.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, being a Spider-Man fan growing up, I knew some of the origin. I didn't know anything about the wrestling stuff. That would have been so easy just to throw it out. Nobody would have really noticed that unless you were the big comic book fans when it came out. They did not need to add that scene. And the fact that they did it, and like you said with the pacing, is it just all zooms by. All of this stuff, if you would have told me this is 10 minutes into the movie, it felt like 10 minutes into the movie because I'm just absolutely loving every single thing I've seen on screen so far. I am 1,000% in on, including up to this next part where we saw Peter before the wrestling match get dropped off by Ben, and Ben was trying to give him a little heart-to-heart talk of just being like, hey, I know you're probably going through some stuff, but I just want you to know we all go through the same stuff, and with something comes something, or whatever the heck he says. I don't remember what the phrase is. With great power comes great responsibility. I know I'm not your Pete, Dad. Well, stop pretending to be.
Oh my gosh, right? And that's one thing that I think is weird is that there's so much tension between them that kind of just comes out of nowhere, right? Peter forgets about painting the kitchen. He's kind of flaking on his duties, and I don't think Ben comes down on him very hard at all. I don't think that there's this unnecessary strength with his lecturing or his parenting style, and so the angst that Peter creates isn't really there, which I think makes what happens so much more tragic, right? Because he's mad at Ben for nothing, and he's taking out that aggression on Ben for doing nothing, and then ultimately we see the result of that. And so I always used to look at that as kind of a poor storytelling, is that there's no reason for that conflict to be there. And then you remember what it's like to be a teenager, right? Is that you look at everything that your parents do or your father figure does, and you see you warp it in your mind and you twist it and you make it something, this big plot against you. And so I think that actually works to raise the stakes on the guilt that Peter feels as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with because that was the exact point I was going to make. Is originally watching that, you always felt like, Peter, will you just take it down about 8 notches? And then you realize how many times you've been a prick to somebody in your life that you probably shouldn't have been. And that's not even with getting superpowers and your neighbor dating the douchiest guy in school and all the other stuff Peter's going through. But there's some very subtle acting by Uncle Ben, Cliff Robertson, in this just right after, and he gets this tear in his eyes, and Peter lingers just for a second before he gets out of the car. And then we fast forward, go through all the wrestling. Peter gets screwed over by the manager of the amateur wrestling night, and he gives him 100 instead of the 3,000, which leads to the infamous manager getting held up at gunpoint, Peter moving out of the way, the guy thanking Peter. Peter gets downstairs, and then that's where he finds out Uncle Ben is shot, and we get a chase scene. We get our first using webs as transportation scene.
Yeah, right. And I think that interaction does a couple things that are genius, right? The thanks and the look, the nod of approval is actually Peter engaging in this criminal activity, right? And so when he gets these superpowers, there are these paths that he can take, right? He can either use them for good or he can use them for ill. And it's at that point that he hasn't made this decision yet, right? And it's fighting internally to see kind of what he can do with that. And he realizes, this person hurt me. I want to hurt him in a way that I know how to do it, right? And so we see that he engages in this criminality, and then we go downstairs and we don't see the death of Uncle Ben, right? We don't hear the gunshots. We just see kind of the aftermath of it, which ultimately sets it up for this great reveal later. But it shows this confusion, right? That Peter doesn't conflate that he's caused this right away. And so it's just another problem on the pile of a very, very terrible, tragic night for him. And it's all this poor me, why do all these things happen to me, that he's able to stack up and see himself as a victim. And it's not until later that we realize that he's the cause of that problem for sure, and probably a lot of the other problems that happen to him as well.
Yeah, that goes back to the reveal of it being Uncle Ben. Comes back to the hard to have that perspective because we've know the story and seen the movie so many times. Is it's hard to think about that is a reveal, but that is definitely a giant reveal. We don't even know, any of that's about to happen. But what happens right after, I think, is I still think this movie is basically in the peaking stages for me. I'm still thinking this is a 15 out of 10 when he starts chasing after him with his webs. And this would be easy to make him look like a baller doing this, but he doesn't. He looks like a kid who's just learning to ride a bike for the first time, and he is sloppy. He's uncoordinated. He's a little awkward, and he is going like a bat out of hell to chase this guy. Now, this is where I go back to the Superman Batman stuff. Is this warehouse scene when he finally catches him? This has a very Batman feel to me, where it's just there's points where you can only see his shadow in the spotlight. The guy is legitimately fearful of Spider-Man. It's just basically not any Spider-Man I've ever seen before, where I think of Spider-Man in the daylight. I think of Spider-Man, like you said, doing quips, jokes, being a smartass while still doing crime fighting. While in this, he is just acting out of anger, revenge, emotion, and it is definitely the darkest scene. This whole portion here is the darkest scene of the movie.
Yeah, for sure, right? He's driven by such rage. And one thing I think this movie does really well is in the comic books, he doesn't find him immediately afterwards. And I think they actually do this in the Andrew Garfield trilogy, is that it's this process where he's looking and looking and looking and looking for this killer over time. But the fact that they have him find him that night, and the fact that he's able to hunt him down so quickly while that rage is still high and that blood is still up, I think that that's such a beautiful scene where he has to learn how to use his powers, and his rage is allowing him to kind of push through those things. And he is sloppy and he is not graceful. He's much more aggressive because, like you said, it sends so many tones of Batman, because that's, again, Peter deciding what he wants to be. Does he want to be this sentinel of justice like Superman is, or does he want to be this person who uses fear to, control these situations and uses fear as a deterrent to crime as well, basically becoming a much darker menace or vigilante, obviously, that becomes a theme for the movie later on. And so I think the fact that he is able to quell that rage and realize that killing this man isn't going to bring Uncle Ben back, ultimately is such a huge progression for his character.
I agree. Yeah, I like all of that. You see the guy dies. He trips on accident. Kind of probably debatable on whether Spider-Man can save him or not. But from the web crawling or the web swinging we just saw, he probably wouldn't be skilled enough even to save the guy. You can tell he basically immediately regrets having that happen. And then the next stuff we get is we get a graduation. And we get Norman at the graduation. We get a lot of shorthanded. And then we get to finally go to New York City. Do you got anything about the graduation stuff at all, or should we just move to New York?
This is a point where this movie is very clearly split in half. And I actually, looking back at this, I can't believe that all of this is in one movie, right? We see the birth of Spider-Man. We see the Uncle Ben moment. We see the revenge, not necessarily the revenge not taken by Peter. We see him graduate, and that's enough for one movie, right? That could definitely all exist within one movie. But it tells it at such a great pace that it doesn't feel like there's too much jammed in here. Like recounting it and talking about it now seems like insanity, but like as the movie was going, I never felt like there was too much. And so this is a great turning point where now he is Spider-Man, and the movie becomes about the conflict between him and Norman Osborn, obviously. And so I think that transition is interesting. Moving them into Manhattan, moving them into college is a welcome change, and it totally changes the I guess setting, obviously, and the stage of the movie. It becomes something totally different to me now.
Yeah, I liked what you said earlier about that the whole origin story basically could be an entire movie. That was the point I was going to bring up earlier. It feels like Uncle Ben's death could maybe be like the end of a Spider-Man movie, and then that very end of the movie then is him. He came to grips with it, and he decides that the next movie he's actually going to be Spider-Man. He's going to be this character. But one of the interesting things that I do think they do well is that they do parallel with Peter Parker is in Queens while Spider-Man is in Manhattan. And he basically leaves back that version of Peter Parker with him. And they do a couple things later on in the movie to do that same parallel. But I definitely like the move to New York. I feel like since it does feel like the first, because I believe it's about an hour into the movie, maybe a little less than an hour. It's probably about 50 minutes up to Ben. I know. Up to Uncle Ben's death. So it's a little less than half of the movie. And it almost feels like that is the climax of the movie. Like that feels like that's what we've been working towards, is because now Peters has this realization. He just had this character arc. He is now growing as a person. So the move to New York City really gives it a new jolt of energy. I wouldn't say the first half needed a jolt, but the second half is going to need a jolt. And I feel like there's two different things that really, really do. I wish it was Green Goblin that gave it the jolt, but there's New York setting and there's J. Jonah Jameson. And that is just, when he gets introduced, he steals every single scene. One of the things I definitely wrote down by his name is I would put him up to any character that is a comic book character and have the J.K. Simmons version compete with that, whether it's Christopher Reeve Superman, whether it's Heath Ledger Joker. No matter how top of the top it is, I think that is right where J.K. Simmons is as well in the Spider-Man series.
Right, and so as we were making our list of the top 5 superhero costumes, I almost put J. Jonah Jameson on there because he is J.K. Simmons, right? He is J. Jonah Jameson. They are one and the same, right? The gruff voice, the look, right? He looks exactly like he was just pulled straight off of the page, right? And there's a reason why they talk about how if Jameson comes up in Homecoming in that universe, he has to be played by J.K. Simmons, right? There's nobody else that could do him justice, right? He's the most perfectly casted comic book character that's ever existed, that ever will exist. And like, I have no qualms with that. Anyone can fight me about that. That's 100% objective truth.
I agree. I honestly do agree with all of that. I wrote down another one of the notes is needs to be cast in MCU was one of the things I wrote under his name. He has an energy. He has he's just an actual great actor too. So he brings a weight to each scene, even though he's funny. He's legitimately funny, and it's not just like dad humor funny. There's these little lines he gives just all throughout the movie of, hey, they can't wait. He's about to. Just little things like that, and it's just you never see J.K. Simmons in this role. I remember going out and buying. So I've had 2 different action figure stages in my life. One when I was young, and one as I was in my late teens, early 20s. And I jumped out into a random stage here just so I could go buy J.K. Simmons, J. Jonah Jameson action figures because of how much they look like the old cartoon. that I
Yeah,
used to watch. He is J. Jonah Jameson, and yeah, he's one of the best things I've seen in any comic book movie.
yeah, right. And honestly, he's a seminal character to Peter Parker in the comics, where you have issue after issue after issue to, develop your tertiary characters. In this movie, he had no bearing on the story. He was so peripheral, but they made him powerful, right? They gave him something to do because they knew that they had struck gold with this character, right? And he steals the show, right? He's much more of a villain to Peter Parker, a villain to Spider-Man, and posed much more of a threat than the Green Goblin did, right? The Green Goblin just tried to kill him. J. Jonah Jameson tried to character assassinate him entirely. And I love that dynamic that they have.
For sure. And now looking back at this movie, and it goes back into the just knowing who these characters are and knowing that there's going to be more movies and stuff. But it would be almost odd to, if this was the only Spider-Man movie they made, and to see J. Jonah Jameson in this movie, because he is such a, like you said, powerful. He is a powerful character. In every scene he's in, you think, okay, he's going to have a major bearance on where we're going in the story, what the plot's going to be, what these characters are going through. There's a couple little things like the cops are after him at one point because of the headlines in the Bugle and stuff like that. But it's really just an introduction of a character that should have been closer to Black Widow being introduced in Iron Man 2, sticking out like a sore thumb for later movies. And instead it adds so much to a movie that's already hitting on all cylinders for me.
Right, and we've talked so much already about how it's all natural, like everything makes sense, right? Peter needs money. Peter has this passing interest in photography. He has a way to totally take advantage of, journalistic non-integrity, I guess. And so, all of it comes up exactly the way that it needs to, right? And his relationship with Spider-Man is something that's outed that the Green Goblin later takes advantage of. And this is just a very tight story that's written so well. There are so many places that it could have gone off the rails and could have failed and could have done too much, but it actually does everything so well.
I agree. All right, now let's get to some more Green Goblin. Let's go to little next cameo of Macy Gray and Stan Lee, and we get some Unity Festival where we get some of our first Green Goblin meeting Spider-Man, Spider-Man meeting MJ. We get some in the middle of the daylight CGI in 2002, which is a bold move. Do you got anything you want to talk about with this freaking scene?
I think we've missed when the Goblin goes and blows up the rival.
The proving test ground, yeah.
Yeah, right. Which honestly was a scene that took like 2 minutes, and they just didn't even transition into it. They just showed it and then didn't even transition out of it. It just existed to be like, hey, the Green Meanie, he's up to some stuff. And again, they used Jameson and they used the newspaper to further that story of how much of a menace this Green Goblin was as well. And especially the fact that here's an actual villain doing something, and they don't even focus on him. They focus on what a menace that Spider-Man is as well. Again, that's another side to the story. But we get to the old Macy Gray, which is another thing that dates it, in addition to the homophobia joke. We have Mary Jane kind of in a very culturally insensitive way wearing a kimono for some reason. But we see a lot of the menace, I guess, of Norman Osborn, the fact that he's attacking the board, the fact that he Raiders of the Lost Arks them with this flash pumpkin bomb that turns them into skeleton dust very quickly.
The most Sam Raimi thing, besides maybe the floating skeleton that's happening when Peter's turning into Spider-Man and he's laying on the ground. There's a floating skeleton for some reason. But this is also pretty freaking random that he turns these into skeletons that turn into immediate dust.
That's not how pumpkin bombs work, as we see every other time that he uses pumpkin bombs. But yeah, here we see, the infatuation that Mary Jane has with Spider-Man, quite literally the hero worship, right? We see that not only now is she no longer crushing on the quarterback of the high school football team, but she's crushing on another man wearing a form of a jersey and a superhero costume as well, right? So we see that hero worship is a big part of um, her attraction in men. She and Harry are together, which happens off screen. But like you said, the seed was planted very well at the museum for the field trip, and so it's all somewhat too convenient, but all of it has these seeds that are planted, so it all actually makes sense. And so I don't know. I think that it's cool. It shows the menace of the Green Goblin. It's a first real big action scene for a seasoned and a very skilled Spider-Man. We're able to see all those things kind of come together. So I don't know. I like it. It's weird. The Stan Lee cameo I really love because that's back in the day when it was actually a cameo, and if you blinked, you could miss it. Instead of giving him just stupid lines that totally take away from the tone of the movie. But I really appreciate it. He reaches in, saves a boy, and then it's it. They don't linger on him. They don't say, "Hey guys, that he made this character." They'll linger on him and he can talk. And so I don't know. I thought that that's when they tastefully did those cameos. But all in all, good scene.
Yeah, I honestly, I like the scene too. I know now the second half of this movie, maybe even like the last third of the movie, is not, I don't think, stays at the level as what the first half of the movie is at. And I know there's a lot of back and forth, and maybe not so much back and forth and just back on what Green Goblin's costume is. Power Rangers 1990 Saban's Power Rangers gets tossed out a lot with that. I think there's a couple times in the CGI daylight stuff it doesn't work out so well. But honestly, this goes back to me having a hard time being critical on some of this stuff. This is basically the first, besides with the little montage we got right before or right leading us into New York. This is basically our first actual Spider-Man fighting an arch nemesis, even though it's not necessarily a great fight or the most well choreographed or anything. It's just this is giving me what I want as a kid, wanting to see Spider-Man go against Green Goblin. And it's him saving Mary Jane Watson on this building that looks like it was straight up taken from Batman 1989, where it's a statue of a guy holding on to a walkway. It looks exactly like all the architecture. And,
yeah, it's very gothic. Yeah, absolutely.
For sure. And it's really, really random. And it's also the same scene where Peter straight up Superman's it as he's running away. Just little influences like that. But overall, I like the scene. You can take the helmet with you with Green Goblin. It's just, I like Dafoe, and Dafoe, I think, does as much as he possibly can with the stuff he's given in this. But the mask lets him down so many times. You can't have the proper tension. Actually, I go to fast forward just a little bit, the scene where Green Goblin knocks out Spider-Man, and we get him having this talk with him about how he wants him to join him and how they could be so good together. And you've watched the Netflix Marvel shows where in season 2 of Daredevil is wrapped to the roof with chains, and he's having a philosophical back and forth with Punisher the whole time. And it's some of the best stuff I've seen in any comic book TV show, maybe in just comic book mediums in general, is this back and forth. And we're getting both of them laid out what they feel, why they feel they're in the right, why they feel the other guy's in the wrong, just what their overall idea of the world is. And in this scene, we're getting one person who can barely talk, and we're getting another person that you can't see any emotion from at all. And there's even a point where the sound effects of his eyes from his mask go up, and it sounds so cheesy, and it takes so much away from what this relationship should be of Harry or Norman at being Peter's almost surrogate father and vice versa. And we aren't getting any of that, almost any weight when these two characters are with each other.
Yeah, right. And so the costume is something that I thought was pretty cool at the time. Ultimately, again, like you said, the Power Ranger comparison is apt. But have you ever seen the concept animatronic mask that they've used?
I have looked that up a few times. Yeah, I have.
I just watched a video of it today, and I watched a little bit of the history behind it. And so there are a couple reasons that they didn't use it. It tested very poorly with kids; they were actually terrified of it, and there was this really, really huge hesitation on Sony's part because there was such a backlash with the Penguin in Batman Returns. That scene where he bites off the nose and there's this gushing of the blood. They wanted to avoid any of those types of kind of memories and that type of backlash. And so it didn't test well. And also, Willem Dafoe actually insisted that he did a lot of his own stunts. And he said wearing the apparatus that controlled that mask was very uncomfortable for him, and it didn't allow him to move the way that he needed to. And so there would have had to have been a different stunt double to work for him. And so he was actually kind of instrumental in not allowing that costume to be used. But the way that that mask could emote, in the way that it was just these large exaggerations of Willem Dafoe's actual kind of bone structure, the thing was truly horrifying, and it would have made for such a different vibe from the Green Goblin and a much more sinister kind of I almost want to say clown, right? Because he has a lot of the same Joker tendencies in his looks and in his characters, and in the way that he kind of maniacally dances, especially on that roof scene where he stands and leans against the chimney and he crosses his legs, and you can see that there's this almost jovial nature to his psychosis. Oh my God, that mask would have been so brilliant to use, but what we got instead was the old Goblin mask with the retracting lenses, so we could at least see some emotion from the eyes of Defoe, but it just didn't play as much as it could have.
For sure, yeah. I did not know I've seen the video footage. I didn't know the Batman Returns Penguin aspect of it from the studios just being scared to scare the crap out of kids again. I did know that Defoe was all about doing his own stunts. He did like 90% of the stunts or something like that for this movie, which is awesome. And you can tell a lot of that in those scenes, like what you're saying, him just messing around and stuff, or when he is maybe a little more aggressive, you can tell that Willem Dafoe is doing this because there's a certain amount of character within his body movements. But yeah, there's no weight with that mask at all, and it's so disappointing. It lets him down so much because up to this point, he was taking the material he was giving and expanding it further than probably any right that the material had to. And yeah, it just makes me sad. It's the thing that makes the second half of this movie go from being one of my favorite things I've ever seen to I'm enjoying all of this because I love Spider-Man so much, but Green Goblin just doesn't do it for me. He almost does better for me when he's like on the phone, or the scene where we're getting, now I'm just kind of jumping all over a little bit, but the scene where figures out that he is Goblin and he's talking to himself. I remember as a kid seeing that stuff, and that was kind of freaky, and I wasn't even 100% sure of like what was going on. If this was in his head, or if this was all of a sudden some other being that was there with him, or whatever it is. And now I know it's psychosis, but just those scenes alone show the amount of emoting he could do as a scared version of Norman Osborn, being terrified that he's being taken over by this thing. And then the other version of Norman Osborn where he's so happy that this power he's getting. And it's scary. He is a scary figure until he puts on the thing that's supposed to make him scary, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, right. And that scene that you mentioned where he's having this conversation with what obviously is himself, but the way that the mask is there kind of propped on the edge of the chair and he's able to talk to it in the mirror. And there's every indication that this could be the cheesiest garbage ever, right? Where it says, take a look at the newspaper, and he like looks around like he couldn't see it. And it all works so well because it's this internal conflict that has to be communicated to us verbally because of the medium of film. That's one of the greatest parts, right? And again, I can't believe that all of this is within the movie, right? And so I think this is after he realizes that Peter is Spider-Man. And so this is after the Thanksgiving scene where, again, we see him totally blowing off his son. We see that this new quest to destroy Spider-Man has become, the thing that he seeks out more than anything else. And that's where he realizes that if you want to attack Spider-Man, you have to attack the people that he's closest to, which is one of the biggest failings of Peter Parker, is that ultimately, with all the strength that he has, he continually fails to protect those that he loves. And again, I love all of the character development. I just wish that we could see more of those scenes that he uses without the mask, because he is such a great emotive actor.
The heart Osborn. No, I got you.
Attack his heart.
All right, so let's continue just the jumping around everywhere spot and just get to some specific things I wanted to get to and ask you about, like the iconic in the rain, Spider-Man beating up some thugs in an alleyway, Batman style, and then getting his little smoochy smooch on. I'm assuming this would have to be something you remember watching when this originally came out. This maybe was the scene that I remembered. I was 12, by the way.
Yeah, right. This is an iconic moment, obviously, right. And if you didn't upside down kiss any girls around this time, you weren't living life, right? That's something that you tried every time. And, you would maybe make a joke of it of like, hey, you want to try this Spider-Man thing? And there was no joke about it. Like, you wanted to live that way. You wanted to feel what that was like. And it was always uncomfortable and it was awkward. But it was the most badass thing that you could possibly do with a girl, right? Because you get to live out this fantasy of being Spider-Man. And you ain't shooting webs and you ain't climbing up walls, but you can sure as hell kiss somebody upside down. And I've done it and I still do it to this day.
And then right after... Oh, I didn't pick up that last part right away. Oh, and then the part that comes right after this that I just didn't really realize how jarring this is we have this awesome scene. We have the iconic upside-down Spider-Man kiss. And then the very next scene is the burning building scene. We were talking earlier about just like the pacing and how everything was flowing so well. And this is just kind of where the movie, again, just starts to just, I shouldn't say off track. It's just not where it was. And I do actually even like the scene where it's Spider-Man gets stopped by the cops, or he saves the baby and then the cops try to arrest him and he says he needs to go save somebody else and they're going to be waiting for him, but he ain't coming back. It's just a little shorthand of what kind of his relationship is with the New York Police Department and kind of all of Spider-Man lore, kind of just his give and take. And then we get in there and we realize that it's Goblin. And Goblin even kind of does this terrifying scream in there. And then we get some of the pumpkin bombs. And we get a little mini action scene. And this goes back to the Matrix again. But this is one of the things that I remember as a kid for sure, is him dodging these pumpkin bombs. The one where he does the straight up Neo going all the way back and they blow up over him. I'm definitely enjoying all of this. And then all of a sudden he just like disappears and then we transition to Thanksgiving. All of this is just seeming so random.
Yeah, right. And like I said, it was hard for me to figure out where this all fit. And then I remember it cuts his arm and that's the getting clipped by the bike messenger. So ultimately that's how Norman realizes that Peter is Spider-Man. And so like, in a narrative sense, we get why it's there, but in a pacing and in a movement from scene to scene sense, that's where it just kind of, like you said, it doesn't go off the rails, but the rail is just straight down, and they're barreling through any obstacle that's there, right? Because they need to tell this story, and so they do it as quickly as they can.
Oh, and then we get the scene where we realize Peter's the bad guy because he had to beat some old lady for some cranberries, apparently. And all the family loves that joke.
Yeah,
dude, honestly, 10 out of 10 laughter he gets from that joke. But I did like the scene. I keep going back to when I remember, like, as a kid, but I do remember him being on the ceiling, the blood slowly coming down from his arm, all this little stuff, that there is this real tension. This is the tension I wanted to feel whenever Norman's in the suit, is that we actually do get to feel when Dafoe is legitimately able to be in the scene two-handing against Peter Parker, because he's bringing this intensity that you just can't possibly get through the costume. And this is either this or the mirror back and forth scene is my favorite with Dafoe, because he is just, where I said at the beginning that I wasn't 100% sure if he was an a-hole or if it was just really his son was kind of a piece of crap. This is where you get that his son is just kind of a little weenie, and that his dad is basically just like evil incarnate when he is yelling about brooming off MJ.
Ooh, yes. Get what you need from her and broom her quick. That is one of my. That's like one of the most iconic lines from it, and I don't think it's meant to be, but it definitely sticks with me so much. And that's when you see that he's just a total asshole, right? And it makes sense why Harry's mother is never around, right? And we see that there's misogyny to him, and we see that there's this kind of manic characteristic that he has, and that's the way that he looks at people. Is that he doesn't look for real relationships. He looks at use people for what you need them for, and then get rid of them. And we've seen him do that throughout this whole movie, even before he was the Goblin, basically.
For sure. Yeah, I agree. This is the type of stuff that I was asking for, basically. Just more of that I didn't think he was quite getting across to me in like the Dr. Strom scenes, or maybe they probably don't want to lay it on too thick with the beginning scene with him and Harry. But this is just where I can finally see everything they've been trying to tell me with the character throughout the movie. This is who he is. And then so after that, we get we get Aunt May's finally her shining moment where she's doing some praying, and he tells her,
"Deliver us,
finish it." Oh gosh, this is straight comic booky, but almost not the good comic booky I'm looking for. But it's just all setting up basically that Aunt May's in the hospital.
Yeah, what, he just gives her a heart attack? Like, is that what happens?
Yeah, that was one of the things I was going to ask you about. Is there's no sign of any actual physical harm to her, right? Yeah. And Peter says she's going to be 100% okay. She's just been sleeping, and it's like, what is going on right now?
Yeah. Doesn't kidnap her, doesn't beat her to a pulp, just scares her a little bit.
And then we get a scene that I will always have vivid memories of for a kind of weird reason, I guess, where it's the MJ Peter. MJ's finally realizing she's maybe in love with Peter. And I remember I dated this girl back in high school, and I was 16, and we were talking on the phone, and she was reading these old notes a boyfriend gave her when they were like, 11, some middle school notes.
Yeah.
And one of the notes was the speech Peter Parker gives Mary Jane Watson in the hospital about how he doesn't know how to feel. All you know is that you know what type of man you want to be.
Yeah, dude, that's a smart kid right there.
For sure. Right away, I was like, that's from Spider-Man. But I do really like the scene. This goes back to me just kind of being all in on this development of Mary Jane and Peter, especially because Franco is such a little slimy mother effer the second half of this movie. So I'm happy he walks in when Peter and her are holding hands, because it seems like the only reasons he's into Mary Jane in the first place is because Norman's too into Peter.
Yeah, right. And it's like him inadvertently getting back at his dad, but hurting his friend at the same time.
Yep, exactly. So I'm definitely all in on all of this, which is setting up the climax.
Dude, this scene is iconic and incredible as well, right? And the whole thing is like Aunt May is listening to it, and it's all told through, well, what would Spider-Man say about me or whatever? And so it's Peter finally talking about his feelings about her, but putting it onto somebody else so that he feels comfortable actually talking about it. And again, like, the whispered tones of these conversations, right? And the whole, like, the sexual tension under these breathy voices that they use is actually really believable. And so, that's something that Tobey Maguire does super well, is this, like, demure, like, earnest flirting that he does, where he's, like, spilling his emotions to her. And that's where probably I buy him the most as Peter Parker. And I love, love, love this scene. And again, if you didn't use that line when you were flirting with a girl, you weren't living in 2002.
Oh gosh. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I love all of what's going on in the scene, and I love just that it does set up the what's going to happen next here of everybody else knows.
Yes, dude, that was so good.
And Harry goes and he tells Norman about obviously the love that Mary Jane's now got for Peter. Peter's been in love with MJ since the 3rd or 4th grade, even though he won't admit it. but there's nobody Peter cares for more. And then this sets up the night that Mary Jane Watson died, or the night Gwen Stacy died. I can't remember what the comic book is, because then they basically just do her above. And this is where I come back to the Peter being in Manhattan Peter being in Queens, Spider-Man being in Manhattan. And this is the choice is that he's having to make here at the end is, do you want your Peter Parker life, which is the Mary Jane? Do you want to be able to have the things you want, or do you want to be the hero? Do you want to save people? Do you want the New York City side, which is all these kids?
Called the sadistic choice.
And then he's perfectly standing on the bridge in between Manhattan and Queens, and it's just symbolizing everything that Peter Parker is as a character, is this choice between his responsibility as a person and his responsibility to the power he has to the people.
This is amazing. I've never even realized that, but that's incredible, right? The geographic kind of, I guess, the defining ideas of the geography being who Peter is, Peter or Spider-Man, I think is really cool, right? And I think, maybe the time has passed for this, but so much about him moving to Manhattan also is that when you go to college, you like redefine yourself. And so much of this is about like the growth of a high school age kid. And so it's obviously told through the exaggeration of the superhero, but it's something that everybody can relate to as well, right? And so we get to this choice of, do you want to be this person who can save everybody, or do you want to be this person who's selfish and who will only do things that will benefit you? And it really goes back to the Uncle Ben death. It goes back to this idea of the greater responsibility that he has as well. And it gives him that choice. Again, very reminiscent of Batman Forever, I think this one is, where the Riddler gives him that same choice. But the solution we have is very unique to Spider-Man, right? He says, I'm not going to choose. I'm going to beat you at your own game, and I'm going to save both of them, right?
While risking himself doing it, for sure. Yeah. And don't even get me in it on Batman Forever. They drop him down the same tube. He only has to go down one tube to save them both in that movie. That is, and believe me,
Schumacher.
I'll probably watch that sometime soon because I love movies and hate myself apparently, but it's not great. But yeah, no, I like, honestly, even though I was kind of dissing a little bit on after the Spider-Man montage that opens up the New York City stuff, basically from then on till about here, I'm just not really ride or dying for it like I was before. I'm still enjoying it. It's still Spider-Man. I'm just not fully invested in it. I'm not thinking, wow, this is just blowing my mind every second. But then we get to this stuff, and this one, I think the movie really picks back up. Now we know that Peter knows who the Green Goblin is. Green Goblin knows who Peter is. We still don't know. Peter doesn't know who the Green Goblin is. So then add some weight on the Green Goblin aspect of it that we really didn't have before. And then there's weight on the Spider-Man aspect just because of the things he's having to do of save the one he loves, and he knows that the Green Goblin knows who he is. And so there is all these layers and levels onto it. And then on top of it, the cheesiness, but that I love, of the New York people on the bridge, the people that are willing to sacrifice themselves with Peter, that they're kind of doing the exact same thing he is without the amount of power that Peter has to do it. And it's so corny and it's so cheesy. And
you mess with one of us, you mess with all of
us. For some reason, I'm enjoying all of this.
Yeah, right. And so obviously you made reference to the death on the bridge of Gwen Stacy, right, where ultimately Peter does everything that he can to save this love of his life, and he fails, right? And so this movie kind of lets you know that it's not going to go down the path of that dark tone, right? We see that the hero is given this impossible choice, and so what he does is he uses his power to take that choice away, right? He's able to save both of them successfully and show that good can triumph over evil. And they weren't really going for the darkness that the source material had. And so I think that was probably the right choice at that time, especially because you don't want to introduce one of the most iconic characters and kill him off in the first movie that they appear in, unless you're going to deal with probably the most arch enemy, most important villain of all time of the history. Then you can just kill him, and that's totally fine. Mm-hmm. But again, I move on, right? And so he saves both of them. and again, powerful scene, dynamic scene, and he says, I don't have to choose. I can be both Peter and Spider-Man. It's just, I have to defeat the odds to be able to do that.
Did you, when this movie originally came out, did you know the Gwen Stacy storyline?
Yeah, I did.
Did you think there was ever a point that MJ was going to die or anything at this part?
I don't think that I did. I think that I knew enough about movies at that time to say that, this is a franchise and they'll want to retain these characters. I don't know. I might be giving my younger self a lot more credit, but I don't think that she was going to die. I did think that maybe they were going to go down that route when we get to Spider-Man 3, but that's a long time from now, probably.
For sure. Yeah, I definitely just didn't know even the roots to that story when this came out originally, but I was right there with you where I'm assuming Mary Jane ain't going to die after all the stuff. The whole movie is basically about their relationship paralleling with each other throughout. But then that bridge leads into the set piece of the final fight, where does this fight take place at exactly? Because this is a real place, right?
Again, I don't remember. Nondescript warehouse, it seemed like. The Goblin comes by and grabs him on the glider, right, and then takes him.
Yep, and he just whips him into this window. I couldn't remember if it's a specific spot, but I do remember. Well, obviously I just watched it, but I remember as a kid too, really liking just what the set piece was. I think just the fact that there was so much destruction everywhere around it. It felt like the bricks, the glass, the shards of metal, that there was so much actual danger for not necessarily the guy who's in this mech suit, this metal mech suit, but the kid who's in the spandex suit. He's the one who's going to get cut by these shards. He's the one that's going to be broken by these bricks. And when the pumpkin bomb blows up in his face in slow motion, I remember that so vividly happening. And I'm all in on this scene here at the end, even though it's not the most well choreographed scene. There just seems to be a weight to it that there maybe wasn't at other parts of the movie.
Yeah, right. And there's this incredible obsession in superhero movies where they pay these big name actors. And so even though the character wears a mask, they want to show the character without a mask so often, right? Saw that with Venom in Spider-Man 3. We see that with Black Panther as he removes the vibranium helmet constantly. And so the way that they did that is so genius, to have the final part of the fight be with this unmasked Spider-Man by blowing up half of his mask, I think makes so much sense, and it gets what they want. It allows us to see that facial recognition, but it also is doing it in a way that makes sense. And again, it reveals fully now that Peter is Spider-Man. Norman knew it, but now he's able to see it and react to it and respond to it. And we know that there are no pretenses of secret identity between them as they fight, which I think is beautifully done. And again, finally gets them back to this organic storytelling that they've been doing so well for 50-60% of the movie.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, the no pretenses thing is pretty spot on by you. That is the thing that is adding some gravitas to what they're doing here, and it feels like something could bad happen to one of these two characters. Even though we're thinking this is Spider-Man, Spider-Man's getting out of this. We know how superhero movies works. He is just getting the crap kicked out of him until he finally, the thing that Norman does is he brings up MJ. He's going to kill her nice and slow. And then he starts beating the crap out of him. And then they have the very end scene where it's finally he reveals himself to Peter. And Peter, I was like a father to you, so be a son to me now. Oh my gosh. And just all of this is just where I'm just all back in again. And I have a father. His name is Ben Parker. Godspeed, Spider-Man. Like all of that. And then you get to hear the noise, the spider sense noise, which I don't know if I said it at the beginning during the powers. I always like the way that they did the spider sense, just giving us that noise, just that little audio cue, and we were right there with Spider-Man. And the second you get that, and that's a slow motion, it's a backflip, and it's the same line MJ says to Peter earlier in the movie, "Don't tell Harry."
Mm-hmm.
And then that's how he dies. And that weight, that burden that's then put onto Spider-Man is just, for this character Spider-Man, that is what Spider-Man is to me, is being this light character while in the outfit. But everything under him is basically as dark as what Batman is. And all of these things he holds so much onto his own shoulders. All of this weight, whether it's his responsibility or his burden or not, is he's going to be the one who carries it. And that is what the second, third portion of the movie was missing, was just any of this actual Peter Parker weight that this scene creates.
Yeah, right. And that's so much about why Peter Parker, why Spider-Man is such an iconic character, is that he was the first superhero character with problems, right? That people could relate to, that had, problems with girls, that had problems with his family, that had problems with bullies at school, right? He became this clarion call for like the everyday kid to come and see that, here's me represented as this superhero, as this person with these powers, but he still faces all of the same issues that I face as well. And I thought, seeing that weight on his shoulders and seeing that responsibility that he's forced to carry, and ultimately we see that this breaks his friendship with Harry, right? The fact that he can't say your dad was a villain, your dad was evil, your dad was all these things. He has to just let him believe that his father died as this martyr, and that Spider-Man, was this murderer, right? Was this criminal, and he has to allow his name to be sullied when he's out here doing what's best for every person, right? It's the greatest quandary that we all face is that we're doing something of great benefit, but we're not getting any of the credit for what we have done. And I think that plays so well throughout this whole thematic message within the movie.
For sure. And then we wrap up with the funeral scene, which brings back to the, like you're just talking about, the Harry-Peter relationship. Goes from being a very straightforward friendship of a rich kid and a nerdy kid without neither having any friends, so they're almost friends by necessity. But by the end here, Harry is legitimately, for the first time maybe in the movie, in my point of view, is showing real emotion to Peter, being like, "You're all I got, Peter, and I love you." And then at the same time is that he's going to kill Spider-Man, and it's setting up this, like we've been talking about, this dichotomy, that life that Peter Parker lives every single day. And then we get it reinforced the second after Harry walks away with MJ walking over. All of this is done so well. This is where James Franco, even though it's such a small part, this is where you could see James Franco could actually act. He all of a sudden is bringing some real weight, some real emotion to this scene, and it's maybe a 15-second scene, but you believe Harry. You believe that Harry's broken. You believe that Harry has anger inside of him. That's almost more there than the sadness that should be there. And then we get almost the exact same thing with Mary Jane, where I'm on board as well. Is he's trying to reconcile who he is as Spider-Man, or who he is as Peter Parker, with being able to be Spider-Man, and this is just setting up. I don't know if they'll do it, but just like if they make a sequel, they could make almost the perfect sequel with the end setup that they do here, of just every single problem that I liked about Peter Parker's problems in the first movie. As you can see, they can just compound on those times a million in this next movie. And yeah, the ending for this movie, I just remember thinking, I can't remember exactly what the speech he is when he's giving his voiceover again, which I think his Tobey Maguire's voiceovers are just awesome. But I remember just punching the air, almost screaming out in theaters, just needing to see the next Spider-Man because, just how good this ending was. All of this.
Yeah, right. And it ends in such kind of an Empire way where it could have been easy for him to be triumphant and to get the girl and all those different types of things. But his life is broken because he is Spider-Man. But he accepts that, right? He realizes that he has this responsibility and he can help people, but it often comes at the sacrifice of his own happiness, right? And so he finally, admits that Ben Parker was his father. He admits that Ben was right. He admits that great responsibility and great power do go hand in hand. And so, like you said, he reconciles that fact with himself, and he realizes that he can't be with MJ, that things are going to stay broken with Harry, because he has this commitment to something much greater than himself.
Man. And they say that a hero save us. And then if Macy Gray didn't date it, if the homophobia in the wrestling ring didn't date it, well, we had some Nickelback screaming at us, followed by some Sum 41 in the credits.
Oh, dude, Sum 41. Yeah, there we go.
and I don't have a detailed breakdown of either of those in my notes. So I think that's where we're going to have to end the review. But before we move on, we definitely want to get to the rating. And now, for our rating system, we have a self-made by my friend John rating system. Do we even have an official name for it? The Super Friends Review rating system?
I like that. Super Friends Review rating system.
All right. And so what it is it's a scale of 1 through 5. And instead of being just the generic numbers, we are trying to do, if we haven't let on by now, we're big Marvel fans. Not that we dislike DC, but Marvel's just kind of always been a little more my flavor. And so we have Marvel-centric titles as we use for our rating system. And we start off number 1. The lowest score you can get out of the 1 through 5 is the Irredeemable after the Irredeemable Ant-Man. And number 2 is the Unworthy after the Unworthy Thor. Number 3 is Infamous after the Infamous Iron Man. Number 4 is Amazing after, you guessed it, Amazing Spider-Man. And then to 5 to wrap it up is the Uncanny X-Men. All right, John Strand, on the Super Friends Review rating system, what do you give Sam Raimi's 2002 Spider-Man?
I think my score is actually very apt because I'm going to go with a 4, an Amazing Spider-Man. I think the fact that this is basically the first big marquee superhero movie that we've gotten. I know that X-Men came before this, but to me, seriously, I think that this is a movie that's carried by one superhero, really showed kind of the potential of what the superhero movie could be. It was the first hugely commercial success at the theater as well, because I know X-Men faltered and struggled there a little bit as well. But I think that the amount of stuff that it does, the amount of character building, the amount of storytelling, the pacing of this, and even though it has its missteps, I think overall this movie was absolutely incredible. From the costume of Peter Parker to the growth to the themes of the story as well. I think amazing is the best way to describe it.
All right. Honestly, I'm right there with you. I'm gonna go the Amazing as well. Amazing Spider-Man, the highest possible one I could go. If the around the runtime from an hour 15 to around hour 45, it wasn't top marks. It was never bad. It sometimes hit mediocre, but the first hour of this movie, all of the origin stuff, him getting bit, him doing the wrestling, him any of the MJ stuff, him getting his powers at the school, how his powers are manifesting, Go Web Go, Shazam, Fly, all of this stuff just works so well for me. You said it a couple times during the thing, is that you never even really stop to think about the movie as you're watching it the first hour, because everything is zooming. You're getting so much information without even realizing you're getting so much information. You're getting so much characters without even realizing you're getting so many characters. And just basically was everything I could have ever wanted in a Spider-Man for that first hour. And then there was just a slight lag, and more had to do with just trying to punch the Green Goblin conflict within the Spider-Man conflict after Norman destroyed all the members of his board, and he didn't really have anywhere to go from there. So they had to introduce him not into just Peter's life, but into Spider-Man's life. And that stuff was a little clunky. But then again, at the end, it wrapped up so awesome that I honestly was still so close to putting it at the Uncanny. But I know the certain few movies that I will eventually probably put up there, and this movie isn't quite on the level of those. So I'm going to have to go with an Amazing, which is obviously not a diss. It's good. It's good. Now, before we wrap up, we do have a segment that at least I know I'm excited for. It's called Recommended Reading by my friend, John Strand. Now, John, would you like to maybe give a quick overview in case there's some first-time listeners for the recommended reading?
Yeah, so for recommended reading, I'm obviously, the comics guru for our little podcast here. And so I want to just kind of take this opportunity to say if you like the character of Spider-Man, if you like the character and the storylines of the movies that we watch, I want to just recommend some comic series that you can kind of take a look at and delve in a little bit deeper. So I'm just going to keep it short for you this time. I have three different series that I think you might want to take a look at. First one, probably the most important, is something called the Superior Spider-Man. This takes a Peter who is very far into his career, but it deals with this idea of responsibility and this idea with balancing the life of Peter and the life of Spider-Man at the same time. So in the Superior Spider-Man, one of Spider-Man's major villains, Doc Ock, is actually dying. He's hooked up to all these tubes. He's going through this process of passing away, and he somehow finds a way to transfer his consciousness into Spider-Man. He supersedes Peter and he becomes Otto Octavius, the Spider-Man. And his whole idea is, he says, I could be Spider-Man much better than you ever were, thus becoming the superior Spider-Man. And it's the most comic booky premise, but it's some of the greatest Spider-Man writing that I've ever seen, even though Peter Parker takes kind of a back seat. And so I think it's about a 30-issue run, and really every issue is incredible. So by far, I'd recommend that.
When did that come out?
I don't know. I think 2014-ish, 13, 14.
Oh, pretty new.
Yeah, it's pretty new. I remember kind of going through it, and that's obviously many people really took to that run, and it's written well and it's drawn well, and there are a couple different cameos by some major Spider-Man villains, and so it's really cool. I think that's one of the best kind of self-contained arcs that you can look at. My second one is called Spider-Man Reign, and this deals with almost like an elderly Spider-Man at kind of the end of his ropes, at the end of his life, and dealing with, what is his lasting legacy going to be. I don't want to say too much about that one because it's obviously it's major growth for Spider-Man, leaving his legacy and talking about ultimately after he dies, what are people going to remember him for. It's only 4 issues long. It's really short, but it's really good. And then my last one is, if you want to see Peter Parker fueled by rage like we saw as he kind of hunted down Uncle Ben's killer, after the Civil War, there was a short arc called Spider-Man Back in Black, where he donned the black costume again. Not the symbiote, but the black costume that he created and sewed for himself. And that you see Spider-Man kind of unhinged in what he can do when he's forced into kind of a corner and he has to protect himself and his family. So those are the 3 series that I think you should check out. Go ahead, get to reading.
Oh, right. Heck yeah. I actually do remember when you read the Spider-Man Reign back in the day. I remember the cover of it, actually.
It's him like clutching his own tombstone, I'm pretty sure.
Yep, for sure. In the rain. Absolutely. I do remember that because I wanted to read it. And now I'm going to. Okay. Well, I don't know about you, but that's all I got for this week. Next week, we plan on picking back up off of the 2005 Fantastic Four and jumping in on 2007's Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer. I know the people have been clamoring for the sequel. We decided to give the people what they want, and that's what we're doing next week. But until then, I guess that's it for this week. Make sure you check back. Until then, we'll be up, and away from our computers. Have a good one.